Welcome everyone. Thank you for everyone for coming. It's nice to see a lot of new faces here. And also welcome to those who are following us online as well. And my name is Deb Angus. I'm the founder of this group. And I'm an 18-year survivor warrior. And basically happened in 2001, rear-ended at a red light by a distracted driver. My life has never been the same since. And you figure, oh, how bad could that be? Well, what I didn't realize at that time, I had multiple concussions before that. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So I started up this group in November 2016 because there's too many people are dealing with this and we're not getting the right information to help us and finding ways we can help ourselves. And I think that's all I need to say for that. So tonight we are honored to have a guest speaker, Val Kowal. And actually I've known Val since about 2009, and in 2010 she was my acupuncturist that I was visiting with. She was working on me, and it was the only modality that tamed this intense nerve pain I had on the left side of my face. And so with that, I'll hand over the platform to Val. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It's been a while since I've done presentations, so I'm grateful that Deb has asked me to do this. I'm actually going to be doing follow-ups to this presentation in January and in February as well, okay? And we'll get into that later on. I've been practicing acupuncture for almost 14 years. And prior to practicing acupuncture, I actually studied molecular genetics. And so in my practice, I combine the ancient philosophies of Chinese medicine with the concepts of contemporary science. And I do them through all the modalities that I use. Okay? So today we're going to talk about the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis. This is a really, really important communication system within the body. It is your stress response system. Okay? And stress can be anything. Okay? It doesn't just have to be your concussion. Okay? It could be getting up in the morning. It could be eating something that you are sensitive to. The stress response is going to be the same. And so to really understand how this works, we're going to go through actually what this axis is and what is involved in it. And then in the next section, or the next presentation, we'll get into a little more detail on how it can become disrupted and discombobulated and such. If you have questions as I'm going through, please interrupt me. Okay? For that, it's much easier that way because then we can address it right then and there. Okay? And don't be afraid to ask a question.
Because I wouldn't remember until the end of your...
Exactly. And there's no stupid question. Okay? So if it's related to this or how other things can affect this, do ask. Okay? So stress and trauma are really important things to distinguish because a lot of people seem to think that they are the same things. They're not. Okay? Stress is anything that has the potential to upset our balance, or something we call homeostasis. Okay? That is what keeps your body in balance and in a healthy state. In Chinese medicine, we refer to it as yin and yang. Okay? That yin and yang symbol, some pronounce it yin and yang. Okay? So there are lots of things in the body. HPA Axis is very much involved in trying to maintain that balance of things, but there are many things that will disrupt that. They can come from internal sources, external sources. They can be real, it can be perceived. Okay? So if you're afraid of spiders and you see this teeny tiny spider minding its own business, you're having a stress response because you're fearful of it. Okay? So that's a perceived stress. Actual stress, the real stress, would be a car accident. You see that car coming too. Okay? So if we had to define stress, it happens every day in living. Waking up in the morning, we have a stress reaction. Our cortisol, our stress hormone levels go up when we wake up in the morning. So it is a natural part of life. The key is how do we cope with it. Okay? So the process of living and having stress imposed on you is how we react to it. So do we, stay tense all day long, after we see that spider? Or can we say, it's just a spider and move on, right? Have that momentary, of stress, and then we're good after that, okay? Traumatic experiences are always stressful. every traumatic experience, whether it's emotional trauma. Loss is a big one for emotional trauma, and that has a huge impact on the HPA axis. Physical stressors or physical trauma is also very stressful on the body, okay? But other things such as the kind of food we eat can have an effect on the body too, but that's more of a stressor, which we'll get into. Trauma is way more distressing, and it disturbs the equilibrium way more than stress does. Ultimately, stress will find a way to balance ourselves out again. With trauma, it's very difficult to do that because we've been really thrown off our ability to cope, okay? So that's those feelings of helplessness. I can't focus. I just can't, I don't even know who I am right now. All those dramatic changes. We can dissociate. We can, have excessive reactions to things. Those can be related to trauma. Okay, and the way the trauma affects the HPA axis is a little different than how stress does. Keep pushing the wrong button. So this is the stress response in the body, okay? And I believe Deb went through it when she talked about the autonomic nervous system at one point, right? The fight or flight mechanism. This is your initial response to stress. So from the brain, your senses, your eyes, your ears especially, and your other senses, what they'll do is they'll send a message to an area of the brain, okay? And that area of the brain sends a message to the hypothalamus. And your initial response is, hypothalamus is going to stimulate this, your autonomic nervous system. Think of it like the automatic nervous system, okay? And the aspect of the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic. That's your fight or flight response. That's when, a mother will have superhuman strength and throw a dresser off and hurt the child who that dresser has fallen onto. That's caused by adrenaline or epinephrine, okay? Once this starts fading out, if the stressor is still perceived, the HPA axis gets activated, okay? The HPA axis, the message first goes to the hypothalamus. That's a gland in your brain, and we'll get into that in a moment. And that sends messages to the pituitary gland, which also is in your brain, okay? And we'll get into that in a few minutes, okay? From the pituitary, hormones are sent to the adrenal gland. And your stress hormone, cortisol, is produced, all right? Cortisol is your stress hormone. It is essential for life. You need cortisol.
Now, I just want to clarify for those who are new here tonight and new watching online, when we discussed that was my September 27th presentation, and it was about called Chronic Stress in the Adrenal Fatigue. And that's where we talked about that. For anyone who hasn't seen that presentation, you're highly recommended to watch that one to get a basis understanding of the adrenal system.
Okay. So what happens sometimes, though, is this HPA axis can be overstimulated or stimulated too much. So if somebody has a poor stress response and they're constantly feeling that stress, this often happens with trauma too, is they're reliving that experience. And so they're feeling that stress over and over and over again. And so what happens is this keeps getting activated and more cortisol is being produced. All right? Typically, the cortisol is going to shut off the messages from the pituitary and hypothalamus. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Okay? So the HPA axis it's the center of your stress response system. It's absolutely essential for your stress response. It intertwines the nervous system and your endocrine system, so it ties your nervous system and your hormone system together. Okay? So when that message goes to the autonomic nervous system, that initial stress that produces adrenaline, that goes to the nervous system. When it goes to the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, what happens is it's the hormone system that is activating it. Okay? So it works to regulate your stress response. It also affects your mood. How many people have been depressed after a head injury? Right? Anxiety. Right? And sometimes that can last for years. Okay? Motivation. How many times have you sat down to do something and you just sat there staring at a paper or your computer screen because you just can't get going, or you just can't get out of bed in the morning, right? Metabolism. How many have gained weight after a head injury? Okay. Energy levels. I mean, it all ties to the same thing. You just don't have the energy to exercise or even cook a meal. Sometimes you just don't have it there. And also immune problems. Autoimmunity is very strongly tied to the HPA axis too, whether you have a head injury or not. Okay? So all of these systems in our body all tie back in some way to the HPA axis. And it is said that many chronic illnesses have stress as their root. And this starts with the HPA axis. Okay? So when we look a little more closely at the HPA axis, the hormones, and we're not going to go really in detail on this, but the hormones, so the hypothalamus, releases a hormone which stimulates the pituitary gland. Pituitary releases a hormone which causes your adrenal glands to start producing cortisol. That's basically how it works. And what happens in things like adrenal fatigue, it's thought, is that over time, this system becomes less sensitive to hormones. So like insulin resistance, we become less responsive to our stress hormones. Okay? So this is what's starting to come out now in the science more and more. It's not that the adrenals have less capacity to produce, but the body tells it to shut down because cortisol in high amounts, same thing with adrenaline, can be damaging to the body and the tissues. Blood vessels, heart disease, those kinds of things. So the first thing involved in the HPA axis is obviously the hypothalamus. This is a gland in the brain, okay, and it sits above the pituitary gland, so this little triangle here is the hypothalamus, about where it is, okay? So it kind of sits in the middle of the brain, and it is actually a very, very important brain. This gland is very important for maintaining homeostasis, that balanced state in the body that is so easily disrupted by stressors. The hypothalamus is what connects our nervous system and our hormone system. Okay? So by connecting, those are two major communication systems in the body. If there's a disruption in that communication, then that's going to affect how your HPA axis works, and that's going to affect how everything that comes after the HPA axis is going to work. So this is very central to the functioning of the body. The hypothalamus itself is essential. Okay? Things like body temperature are regulated by the hypothalamus. So again, after a head injury, hot flashes, sweating, feeling cold, hard to regulate your body temperature. Okay? Metabolism, so again, relating to weight, how you digest food, how well your body functions that way. Appetite, thirst, emotions, unstable emotions, up and down. Okay? You can be laughing 1 minute and crying the next. Okay? Or angry the next. Right? Circadian rhythms. I just did a seminar on circadian rhythm, and they're actually, what the research is showing more and more is circadian rhythms are absolutely crucial. And basically your circadian rhythm is your sleep-wake cycle. Now in Chinese medicine, energy flows based on a clock. And what the science is now showing is that not only is there a central clock in the body, but each organ has its own clock. And that's controlled by part of the hypothalamus. Okay? So a disruption in the hypothalamus is going to affect not just how the brain functions, but how the organs function too. It's how things are synchronized. Hormone balance, testosterone deficiencies in men is not an uncommon occurrence after a head injury. Estrogen imbalance is another hormone imbalance. Insulin issues, diabetes are not an uncommon thing after a head injury. Okay. Libido, sexual pleasure, that's related to one of the hormones that come from the hypothalamus. Childbirth, blood pressure regulation is also connected to this. Heart rate, digestion, and also your ability to balance your fluids and electrolytes. So things like muscle cramps, and such can be related to fluid and electrolyte balances. And that can be connected also to blood pressure and things like that too. Am I going too fast?
No, that's good.
Okay. The second part of the HPA axis is the pituitary gland. This is called the master gland, and it's this tiny little thing that sits at the base of the skull, base of the brain in here. It sits in the middle of a bone that sits at the front of your face. That bone is called the sphenoid. And there's a particular little area that it sits in. This gland is about the size of a pea, yet it is absolutely essential. It regulates the functions of the other hormone-producing glands in the body. Okay? It secretes hormones that either stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones from the other endocrine glands in the body. It'll tell your adrenal glands to produce cortisol or not. It'll tell your thyroid to produce thyroid hormone or not. So very, very essential. The last part of the HPA axis is the adrenal glands. Now, they produce hormones that are essential for life, not just for a stress response, but for life itself. You cannot live without adrenal hormones. They're very, very important. There's two components, an interior and an exterior. The outer part is called the cortex, and it produces cortisol and the life-sustaining hormones that we need. Okay? Hormone release from the adrenal glands is actually triggered either by the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and that would be the cortisol, that's your HPA axis, but also the kidney itself. And that's a hormone called aldosterone, which actually regulates blood pressure by controlling sodium and water balance. And also can be affected by the sympathetic nervous system, okay, the fight or flight response, and it'll cause release of adrenaline. Okay? So they're very, very important. In Chinese medicine, the kidneys, which the adrenals sit on top of, because you can see here, this is the kidney, and the adrenals are like a kind of like a little hat that sits on top of them. And in Chinese medicine, the kidneys are the root energies of the body. They're absolutely essential. And when we're looking at complex conditions, one of the first things we look at is the kidneys. And many of the functions ascribed to kidney include adrenal function as well. And we treat a lot of that. Any questions so far? Does it all make sense? Yeah? Good? Yeah? Okay. So in part 2, which is coming at the end of January, we're going to get into a little more interesting stuff. This stuff is how trauma can disrupt the HPA axis. Okay? So how does trauma and stress change how the HPA axis functions? Okay? Because we know with head injuries there's changes in the brain, but stress and trauma are not just brain issues. They affect the whole body. Okay? So we're going to look at how chronic stress injures the HPA axis. We're also going to look at how trauma injures the HPA axis. And there's a number of studies in the military that have looked at PTSD, and some of those changes are different than what we see with chronic stress. We'll also look at other factors that can lead to or aggravate to HPA axis dysfunction, such as aging, whether you're male or female, diet, loss, and other emotional traumas and stresses.
Yeah, and the research I've done too, they say head injury equals, what is it called? Instant aging.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. In part 3, which will be in February, we're going to look at how to optimize HPA axis function. Can you restore it? And how much can you restore it? What are the steps you can do to help restore HPA axis function? How can you optimize it again? Because the body's very plastic. It can regenerate. And we just have to work on doing that. So we're going to go through some easy steps that you can do that'll help with that. We're also going to look at techniques and therapies for healing the HPA axis. Okay? Now, I practice Chinese medicine and acupuncture, so we will discuss some of those. Okay? And there's some pretty nifty techniques that we do for hormone balancing and strengthening the adrenals and stuff for head injuries and things like that. There's some pretty neat things that they do. But we'll also look at things like essential oils. We'll also look at things like diet and how diet can help normalize this function again. Because if you're sensitive to certain foods, it's a stressor to your body. So you're triggering the HPA axis by eating foods you're sensitive to, which triggers inflammation, which of course can affect how the HPA axis is functioning. Okay, so it's going to be kind of interesting. Yeah, quite interesting actually. I've really enjoyed it. So this is where my practice is. And if you have questions, you're more than welcome to contact me and ask questions. And I do, as I said, I do a lot of research, and I combine a lot of Chinese medicine with current science and medicine.
I'm quite impressed with your genetics background too, how this all works in.
Yes, and actually that's one area in my practice that I'm looking a lot at, is how we can use acupuncture, herbs, and food. China has a very long history in Chinese medicine, using food as medicine, and how we can use these things to actually change gene regulation. And that's really fascinating. Yeah. So if anybody has questions, please ask.
I have one question. It might sound obvious, but is there a chronological correlation to how long your head injury, like you've moved past concussion to post-concussion and now TBI, to the onset of the symptoms you're talking about with the HPA axis? It seems obvious, but do you find people that have been, say, 10 years have those onset of the HPA axis more than, say, a concussion?
Not necessarily. It's just what we see is more acute versus chronic symptoms. And so HPA axis dysfunction can occur very quickly. But over time, I mean, when we look at a stressor, and you know, it's the frequency and intensity of the stressful episodes that will have a greater impact on our ability to rebalance. Okay, so the longer you've had it, the chances are it's going to take a little longer to change it. All right, but it doesn't necessarily mean things are way more severe in that sense. It just means it's been there longer. And the interesting thing from the Chinese medical perspective is we do look at those old traumas, because they create a pattern. It's like an imprint in your body, and we work on those patterns. And so we may not even touch your head in order to affect the head, because we're working on the pattern that is exhibited everywhere. Stress and trauma are whole body things. They affect the entire body. And so for you, it may manifest, you know, as one pattern, and somebody else, it may manifest totally different, right? And so how it's affecting your HPA axis is also going to be individual for you. But you know, something that's long-standing, it doesn't make it any. I don't believe it's going to affect the ability to start changing it. Okay, I mean, I know when I was working with one lady in school, they told us for facial paralysis, they said 6 months for Bell's palsy. That's about the limit you have. I worked on somebody who had it for 25 years. And we probably got 70 to 80% recovery after 25 years. So everybody's body's different. And sometimes, you know, we have to nourish the body before we can start moving things. And when there's an injury, there's a stasis. And the key is to move that to allow a normal flow of energy in that part of the body, to allow it to start being nourished. And that's when we really start seeing the changes.
And along those lines, does age have anything to do with that? We've had members here who said that you're too old and it's been too long. There's nothing we can do to help you.
Well, I mean, age affects different things, and I mean, cortisol goes up as we get older, especially in women. But there are ways to balance that, and we have to look at the body as it is presenting to us now, and we work on changing that to make that as healthy and as normal as we can. So age can have an impact for sure. We have less resources as we get older. Things become depleted more, but it doesn't mean you can't build some of them up a little bit. Yeah.
There should be some room for improvement.
Of course. I mean, treating stroke patients, most of them are older that we treat. And I mean, we see recovery in stroke patients with acupuncture. Yeah. So it doesn't matter how old you are. Yeah.
I think back to your original question, though, it also takes quite a while before the symptoms can show up, though. Like before your growth hormone is going to drop off, or your testosterone levels, it's not day one after the incident. It's going to be a year plus before that starts to show
Yeah.
up, before everything, the recovery is slow to build, and it's also slow before it starts to show up in any testing.
Yeah, there's a cascading effect that does happen over time, but I mean, the injury's there, right?
And
So,
it may explain the typical breakdown if you get somebody who goes back to work for 2 or 3 years and then collapses,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And those collapses are hinged on symptoms that are right there. Right?
Yes, and I mean, it's that capacity to cope, right?
Yeah.
And so part of that recovery is helping that person build that capacity to cope again, teaching them those techniques to help them cope with stresses, so they're not reliving the trauma per se, but the stress adds to things over and over again, right? So it reactivates it, and and what happens over time is that it becomes less responsive, and so then you end up crashing.
Yep.
Right? And so it's helping build up that reserve again and that ability to cope, which also is helping to shut down the sympathetic nervous system, calm it, okay, and toning the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve, okay, but also recreating that sensitivity to stress hormones, okay, and we do that by normalizing that stress response. When we become conditioned to overreact to something, we automatically go to that. And so it's learning those techniques to bring that back down again. Yeah. Anything else?
Well, thank you very much, Val.
You're welcome.